You can feel how you will every time you see old glory unfurled, but these colors don't run. These colors don't run. These colors don't run the world. Contras kill civilian populations, destroy their clinics and their schools, their cropland and water systems, to decide which Samosa rules. You can say they hate our freedoms, but look at the damage that we've done to get every precious metal and fossil fuel and their labor under our thumb. You can feel how you will every time you see old glory unfurled. But these colors don't run. These colors don't run. These colors
an audience in Pyongyang of 115,000 North Koreans standing on their feet and clapping the entire time, wildly cheering. President Moon said, "The two leaders solemnly declared to 80 million Koreans and to the entire world that there would be no more war on the Korean Peninsula and that a new era of peace had opened." So let's just think about this for a moment. Who is President Moon? Right? He's the president of South Korea, but what do we know about him? His mother was born in the North. Their family fled during the Korean War. This is a man who served in the South Korean military and helped bring peace during a military skirmish between the US and North Korean soldiers at the DMZ. He was a human rights lawyer who helped bring down US-backed dictatorship and usher in democracy. Imagine what it must be like for President Moon, who was swept into power by the candlelight revolution of 16 million South Koreans. 1 in 3 South Korean took to the streets in the fall and the winter of 2016 and 17, demanding the impeachment of the corrupt president Park Geun-hye, who was the daughter of the former dictator Park Chung-hee, who ruled South Korea with an iron fist for 17 years. They're going to establish a reunion center for divided families. Who saw the images last month of the family reunions, right? Of Koreans in their 70s, of their 80s, of their 90s, who haven't seen their loved ones, their siblings, their brothers and sisters, their mother. I mean, they are going to set up a reunion center. Okay, they also are going to reestablish Kaesong. That was the joint industrial complex that was started between North and South Korea during the last Sunshine era. They're going to reopen Mount Gumgang. It was a site of tourism. A lot of South Koreans went there. And they are de-mining a village in the DMZ. Oh my God. In my wildest dreams, I could have never imagined this moment. But North Korea is unlikely to unilaterally surrender its nuclear weapons without improved relations. I mean, Kim has seen what happened to Iraq. Kim has seen what happened to Libya, and Kim is now seeing what is happening to Iran, not to mention North Korea's own history of surviving indiscriminate US bombing. 16 countries fought in that war on the US side. Canada was one of those countries that fought in that war. The greatest enemy to peace is apathy and the belief that we can't overpower those wanting perpetual war. So we're launching this Women-Led Korea Peace Treaty campaign, the 2020 Women-Led Peace Treaty campaign. We're going to be mobilizing women globally to put pressure on the US, the UN, and key countries like Canada. We're going to see a peace agreement to end the Korean War. And we see
what ended up happening was that the police descended into us a bit and just knocked everyone down, from like elders to children to just everyone was like flat on the floor. And what was terrifying to me was that they looked terrified. to me, that showed me that there was something like really, really deep within them that taught them that they were supposed to fear us. And that this was larger than just the police who were in front of me. There was a whole system involved that I wasn't aware of, or at least I didn't let myself be aware of. So the moment that changed my life, when I moved off the fence and I jumped in, was a young girl, about 4 or 5 years old. Her mother was pinned down and she was screaming. She screamed that the police officer let her mother go, and the police officer looked at her, rolled his fist, and punched her in the arm. And this was a young white girl, and I was shocked. And the scream that came out of her, I was like, there was no way I can pretend or act as if I'm not involved anymore. I can't go on with my life and dance in my studio and not come out here and figure out how I can support. But I also feel like it's important that even though we're talking about destabilizing war, that we also talk about ways to generate hope and possibility using creative activism. There was a disturbance. So the police were called, and they showed up to his place. He showed up to the door wearing shorts, no shirt, and no shoes. And they asked him to come outside. He said, why? They didn't answer. They said, come outside. He was like, no, I don't have to. I don't know what's going on. You have to give me a reason. And they pulled him out. So they dragged him out. There were 2 officers who dragged him out of the house. His mother, who didn't speak much English, grabbed her pen because she didn't understand what was happening and freed her son. He then ran away, ran down the block, and the officers proceeded to arrest his mother. His mother was really, really confused, was really out of, didn't know what was really happening. And when he saw his mother being arrested, he came back. On his way back, he was shot at 19 times. And, and 5 of the bullets hit other officers. And 1 bullet, the only story that came out of this was this 1 bullet that went into a neighbor's house, a woman who was cutting her vegetables, and hit her in the spine. She is now paralyzed. That is the story that went into the news. There was a disturbance, and a woman was paralyzed in the altercation, but you didn't hear about the young man who was shot at 19 times, or his mother, who was given no information about him after they took his body from the scene. How it represents an important need that we have to disarm the police. And I know people think that that's strange to think about disarming the police. This is what I've heard. It's not possible. But there are places and countries in the world that have disarmed the police, and there has been more peace in that area and more relationships formed between the police and the communities in those countries. And it's just a matter of if you want to change.
And what I want to do is I want to very, very quickly go over 3 areas of really dramatic law reform that have taken place internationally since World War II, and to suggest to you that that's the way, as jumping off on what Kevin has been saying, that one of the tools that you can try and use to stop war. Universal acceptance by the United Nations, the African Union, the European Union, the Organization of American States, in the rule of law principle as the principle that governing legitimate governments and legitimate legal systems. That's number 1. Number 2, starting within the United Nations and also in the other regional organizations that I just mentioned, since the Second World War, there's been the development of a huge amount of human rights laws. So that's all kinds of treaties like the Convention Against Torture, the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights. And these treaties have created individual rights on the one hand, and on the other hand, they have restricted the power of states by imposing on states the duties to ensure those rights and to ensure remedies for violations of those rights. And the third thing is the development through the United Nations and then through the most recently through the Rome Statute of a Criminal Court of first the prohibition against the use of force against what's called the crime of aggression, in other words, war. And the International Criminal Court itself came into force on July the 1st, 2002. Canada left Afghanistan June 28th. So monitoring bodies, so for instance, the UN Committee Against Torture, individuals and groups, you don't even have to be a group to make a report. Anybody can file a report. All you have to do is make the deadline and comply with the requirements of report filing, which isn't difficult. And if a report is filed that is well researched, clearly written, and addresses the factual and jurisdictional issues, then it's very, very likely that the recommendations that you ask for in your report will be repeated by the Committee Against Torture. We now have to become the decision makers. We have to become the decision makers, the lawmakers, the litigators. We have to do the work to become the people who force enforcement of the law, because all of those human rights, thank you. All of those human rights treaties that are, and the Rome, including the Rome Statute, there's nobody to enforce them except you and I.
And yes, maybe it is linked with the Briand-Kellogg Pact and the Charter of United Nations, which makes every war illegal. Every war. I try to convince my students that war is illegal, and I read the Charter and I say, you can only use force. You can't do wars. You can't wage wars anymore. It's illegal under the United Nations Charter. But I realize that young people, my students at the law faculty of the Université de Montréal, believe that wars are illegal and that some things are not morally acceptable, that when things are illegal, you have to do something about it. And that's why in the past years, I've been working with students and bringing cases before Canadian courts, because it's not only international law that can allow us to do something about wars or about trade in arms, thing the Canadian government wanted to do. And it wanted to, and still wants, obviously, to sell these very dangerous equipment to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, the country that has the worst record when it comes to human rights in the world, that the export of military equipment must be subject to strict controls to, and I quote, countries where citizens' rights are subject to serious and repeated violations by the government, unless it can be demonstrated that there is no reasonable risk that the material will be used against the civilian population. So it sounds quite reasonable, that you shouldn't send equipment to those countries where there's a risk that these equipment be used to breach human rights. So
I just want to ask about this idea that you shouldn't sell military weapons to a country that might abuse human rights, because I don't understand how you can use military weapons and not abuse human rights. And there seems to be a misunderstanding built into the whole idea. Can you comment?
We have about 14,000 nuclear weapons still in existence, down from about 70,000. Woohoo! So that's good. Still a long way to go, of course. The problem is that while the numbers have gone down since the end of the Cold War, the money being poured into these systems has not gone down. And in fact, it's been going up and up and up and up. And it went up under the Obama administration, and it's going up now. Billions of dollars being spent in the United States on its nuclear weapons, but also in Russia, in China, in India, France, the UK. Every country that has nuclear weapons is investing money into refurbishing their arsenals. They call it modernization. They're legally obligated to eliminate their arsenals and have not complied with that. 9 states are holding the rest of us ransom. And the rest of the world has categorically rejected these weapons. But what can they actually do about it? How can they help compel the nuclear armed states to eliminate their arsenals? So while we've had these disappointments, these frustrations, the reinvestment in nuclear weapons, we've also had some positive lessons. And so 2 of these lessons came from prohibitions of other weapon systems, landmines and cluster bombs. We had a series of global conferences on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons with the purpose of seizing the discourse around nuclear weapons, taking it back from those that had turned it into a techno-strategic jargon about how nuclear weapons are instrumental for our security, how they're somehow magical tools that prevent war, and really breaking that down, disrupting that narrative, showing it to be false as it is, talking about nuclear weapons as tools of violence, of massive nuclear violence, talking about what nuclear weapons do to the environment, to the human bodies. We were actually aided to a large extent by the nuclear armed states and by some of their nuclear weapon-loving allies. And that was because of their arrogance. And so this is a really interesting phenomenon that I think has resonance across issues. But they boycotted all of those public meetings. They refused to come to meetings that were about their weapons. The activism now in the ICANN campaign is focused on getting this treaty into force. We need 50 countries to ratify it to enter into force.
Now some folk may be saying that we're living deep in sin, but greater sin to fight a war that takes away the man and leaves the families behind surviving as we can. We'll make it clear to all who hear, we'll not fight your war again.
We've got to educate more people, especially the American people, to say, let's open our eyes and figure out how we're going to stop our government from dragging us into another war. How ironic is it when the U.S. is going on and on about Russian interference in our elections to not do a little history lesson and talk about things like the 1953 coup, when a democratically elected government, elected with a massive following and a mandate from the people to say, our oil should be our oil and should be used to benefit the Iranian people and not the British, because it was a company that became British Petroleum. And when Brian Hook talked yesterday, he acted as if this was a negotiation between 2 countries, just the US and Iran, and it wasn't a treaty, so it wasn't very important. Well, hello, this was negotiations that was not just between the US and Iran. It was between the UK, France, Germany, Russia, China. It was approved by the entire European Union and unanimously by the UN Security Council. Many Iranians say that one of the biggest problems of our economy in Iran is the corruption of government entities or government-related entities. There are revolutionary guards that own large sectors of the Iranian economy. There are clerical groups that own large sectors of the Iranian economy. But when you impose sanctions, what does it do? It strengthens those sectors, because people have to look for things like on the black market. And who runs the black market? Those very groups. People have to look for the state for getting things that they can't get because they're choked off from getting access to dollars or imports. What does it mean to people who want to make changes inside Iran? They have to struggle to get medicines. They have to struggle to find food. They have to struggle with their daily lives, instead of doing things like building up a more vibrant civil society. it also means that the conservatives could then say it's the U.S. fault.
From the beginning, when World Beyond War was founded in almost 5 years ago, it'll be 5 years in January, the idea was to create a network of international participation, because we know it's going to take all of the world's people to end the madness of war. And so we are trying as best we can to keep moving out, and find more people and form together a network of people who are trying to and understand that it actually can be done. We can end war. So since our humble beginning in 2014, we now have over 75,000 signatures on our Declaration of Peace. Over 500 organizations have signed to our Declaration of Peace. And this is the part that I just thrills me every time, is that those people and those organizations are from 173 countries.
I am a World Beyond War activist, organizer in Japan. But the anti-war movement is weak in Japan. The ultra-right is well-funded and dominates the media. Teachers have not taught their students their country's history. Well, our first educational event will be on November 10th, remembering the 100th anniversary of Armistice Day. I have invited the renowned photojournalist Kenji Higuchi to Nagoya to speak about the history of poison gas as a weapon, and I've rented one of the larger halls in Nagoya for peace on the Korean Peninsula, and we've had 4 demos for that. We've used candlelights, just like the South Koreans have used in their candlelight revolution.
I come from the country of Florida. I live in a place that is the world's largest retirement community. It's active adults, 55 and over. We're 130,000 people, and we're growing by 5,000 people every year. For the last 4 out of the last 5 years, we've been the fastest growing metropolitan statistical area in the United States. By the way, it's really good to see young people here. So we have a whole lot of people in my community who support any and every war the United States has ever started. Our focus is on education and some action. Our biggest challenge is getting a bunch of old people to skip golf and tennis and pickleball and swimming pools and come to our meetings and learn something.
It's the 125th anniversary of New Zealand women voting. We have been nuclear free for 31 years. I'm involved with the Hit and Run Inquiry campaign, or World Beyond War is, which is a campaign to get accountability for some of the atrocities in Afghanistan, where civilians, and there's also a legal case that we're supporting, where some Afghan civilians have asked for taking the government to court for hurting, they want accountability and recompense.
It was back in 1970, after that first lottery, when Jeffrey pulled the number 4. He went down to his induction, not knowing his malfunction, when the doctor started to explore. He had him cough, stick out his tongue, say, ah, took his pressure pulse, then the doctor saw. When he went to Jeffrey's scrotum to see how he did totem, he discovered that he only had 1 ball. Excuse me, this is a serious song. You see, at birth 1 testicle was upended, so only 1 of them descended. Cryptorchidism's what you call it, and it's important to the army how you haul it. Flat feet and venereal infection, esophagitis, all reasons for rejection. But Jeffrey's only flaw, from his toenails to his jaw, was a missing testicle upon inspection.
And today we're fighting on the U.S. side in the struggle to dominate the people of the world. And we are repeating, and this is my contribution, we are repeating a pattern which was established in 1899, the first time we went bounding off to South Africa. That Trudeau the Elder was wrong about the elephant. He said, we've got this big elephant in the south of us, and when it rolls over or does something, then it's a big problem for us, and we got to accommodate that. No, we don't. Canada can get free of the U.S. military, and I would add, get free also in matters of the environment and matters of the economy. We Canadians are real interested in our place on the world stage. We even have a myth about it, that we came of age at an obscure place called Vimy Ridge in an obscure battle in a war that was nonsense in the first place. But we're really concerned about our place on the world stage. And that factor of longing for recognition is absolutely off the chart when it comes to Canadian military hierarchy. The Canadian generals, as opposed to ordinary soldiers, are envious to a fault of their American counterparts and all the wonderful toys that they have to play with. They are not interested in peace or peacekeeping. General Rick Hillier reminded us years ago that the purpose of the Canadian forces is to kill people. And a lot of Canadians seem to forget that. But the real danger is that these generals exert undue influence on the government. This is the Afghanistan Memorial in Victoria, British Columbia. So when your ordinary Canadian wants to know why we were in Afghanistan, the answer is very simple. We were there to help children and build schools and hospitals and little girls. It's a lovely memorial, and it's also outright propaganda. I want you to commit to speaking at least once a week about Canada and war to a fellow Canadian who is not part of a peace group or a progressive church. Who will do that? Who will talk to their neighbors who are too busy taking the kids to hockey practice to worry about this stuff? Thank you, thank you. And talk to the people who didn't raise their hands. Rely in these conversations mostly on questions, not statements. And that is very important because it's clear that you know more than they know about these matters. But it's also clear that you're not going to change their mind by bombarding them with facts and truth. So, and it's also, they've been getting a free ride. We don't ask them questions. And so they don't have to think and justify what they are supporting. So use questions and not statements. For example, so help me understand what it is that makes it worthwhile to kill civilians.
So because Canada is refusing to pursue an ICC, investigate a national inquiry into Canada's role in torture in Afghanistan, a Canadian law professor at Osgoode Law School here in Toronto filed a submission to the ICC asking for the ICC to investigate Canada. His name is Craig Scott, and he is a former member of Parliament in the House of Commons. Yesterday, our Global Affairs Minister is hosting a 2-day historic meeting of female foreign ministers around the world in Montreal for 2 days. And what's at the top of their agenda? Well, to talk about feminist foreign policy. It is very important for us to consider the supposed progress that Canada is making on women, peace, and security in a broader context. So let's start with last year. Our Global Affairs Minister stood up in the House of Commons and she presented Canada's new foreign policy. And she said Canada needs hard power to support the global order. And if you notice by the arrow there, she also called for an increase in defense spending. Now, this is our Foreign Affairs Minister, right? And this is from her speech in the House of Commons, and I'll just read this quote. To put it plainly, Canadian diplomacy and development sometimes requires the backing of hard power. We will make the necessary investments in our military to not only redress years of neglect and underfunding, but also to place the Canadian Armed Forces on a new footing with the equipment, training, resources, and consistent, predictable funding they need to do their difficult, dangerous, and important work. Well, the very next day in the House of Commons, our Minister of National Defense, Harjit Sajjan, stood up and announced Canada's new defense policy. We are going to massively increase military spending to $32 billion by 2026. We're going to be building more warships, buying more fighter jets, buying new armed drones and attack helicopters. We're going to increase the number of special forces that we have. We are going to recruit more soldiers, and we're going to especially target women and First Nations and minorities. Now, this defense policy, if you read it, is much worse than Harper's 2008 Canada Defense Strategy. Now, what is Canada doing with all of this money and with all of this equipment? Well, we are not doing peacekeeping. We haven't been doing peacekeeping seriously in the last 20 years. Canada right now is ranked 61st. We have only 173 soldiers wearing blue helmets. Most of the soldiers are right now in Mali, working alongside France in a neo-colonial project in their former colony. Now, this is the state of Canadian war making. Canada is working with Canada is working with the Lima Group to overthrow the Maduro government in Venezuela, just like we did in Haiti in 2004. We're selling arms to Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Israel, and Bahrain. We are literally fueling the conflict and the refugee crisis in Syria and in Iraq. We have Canadian soldiers along the border of Russia, provoking Russia in Latvia, Poland, and the Ukraine. We, earlier this year, the Canadian Navy was partnering with the US AFRICOM on naval exercise off the coast of Africa, and we've got special forces across Africa in the Middle East.
So, we will not kill for you. We will not kill for you. And to that end, you know, I work at the University of Toronto, and I got the Order of Canada. I guess they think I'm a loyal Canadian. I don't know. But they invited me to do the November 11th talk. And I said, I don't think you want me to say something on November 11th. I am the great-great-granddaughter of the Princess of Peace, and we said we would not kill for you, and we haven't. So if I get up there and speak, I will talk about that. That the killing is what we do here in the West best. 110,000 dead Afghans, 6,000 dead Americans. I don't know how many dead Canadians, but I am not going to get up and laud and feel grievous toward the dead soldiers who killed that many people. First of all, warring nations experience family violence. 1/3 of the people in this province are immersed in family violence. Half of Americans are immersed in family violence. The soldiers come back and are not right in their minds. And there's no addressing the lack of rightness of the mind of those soldiers. So the Americans can hardly wait for the next war to deploy those guys again. And then it goes on and on. Since Korea, there hasn't been let up in America. There was a little bit of a let up under Pearson here with the peacekeeping that Canadians engaged in. But then Harper hijacked the country and ended that.
Now it was back in 1988 with the occupation of the Palestine state, when Beit Sahur bought 18 cows, but it wasn't what the law allows. If you want to drink milk, the law of the state says you get it from Israel, not a farm you create. So 18 cows went underground, and for the next 4 years they couldn't be found.
But one thing I just want to point out this morning before we start our next panel is this wonderful book which you've all been gobbling up here at the conference. And this book, A Global Security System, an Alternative to War, which we publish every year to bring out new thinking and emergent issues related to global peace and security. This
planetary emergency, breakdown or breakthrough. We face on this planet an incredible plethora of crises. It's not just war and the fact that we need to outlaw it and put an end to it, but we are also facing a whole system of intertwined crises, including such things as an extinction crisis that has not occurred in this rate since the last 65 million years, endemic war, climate deterioration with all that implies, dying oceans, decaying cities, a toxic food system, both in production and distribution, water shortages, soil exhaustion, pandemic disease, gross inequality, and all of these are leading to an undermining of the ecological basis on which civilization rests. And so we face in the next 100 years breakdown or breakthrough. And migrants are trying to get into India, and the Indians have built a wall, and they've already killed 1,000 Bangladeshis who have been trying to get through it. Think what's going to happen in terms of violence when the climate that produces the glaciers that feed the rivers that irrigate Southwest Asia and Southeast Asia, the Indus, the Mekong, the Ganges, these rivers that irrigate food for hundreds of millions of people, those are going to dry up. And then where are those people going to go? So together, all of these crises constitute a planetary emergency. We need to make peace with each other and with the earth before we destroy the earth and ourselves. And this will require a whole new body of international law of global governance, perhaps extending globally such initiatives as Ecuador's constitutional amendment giving legal rights to nature. But we must do more than educate, we need to activate, because global governance is not going to come from above. It's going to have to rise from below.
We can all agree that we need alternatives to war. We need alternatives to war. And to me, that spells out global alternative dispute resolution. Global alternative dispute resolution. And that in turn contemplates compulsory international dispute resolution. The mechanisms that have been utilized increasingly in domestic courts, like mediation and arbitration, and in the international level would be adjudication. And we'll be immediately asked, I think, by anybody, what's going to make international dispute resolution compulsory? And the answer has to be, and this is maybe a little difficult to understand, it would have to be an increasingly strong, growing international norm. Nothing more and nothing less. And so I find a quote from one of the nuclear weapons industry insiders in which he says, typical professorial kind of statement, quote, "It has always been acknowledged that an international security system based on the willingness of nations to commit mutual suicide in order to protect themselves is a suboptimal solution to the security dilemma." And then briefly, I want to talk about the third element of the proposal that we make, which is basically having various enforcement mechanisms, including the start that would solve, I think, 98% of everything, the force of world opinion.
So while, unfortunately, populist nationalist rhetoric isn't new at all, what's new about it and what's sort of the novel challenge for global governance currently and for people in civil society interested in sort of peace and conflict issues is the ability of this information to spread quite quickly. And a lot of times there's misinformation. And so I don't know if you're aware of this, there's an application called Lyrebird, which is able to use your voice. You train the system by repeating sentences, and then it's able to use your voice and carry on a conversation as if you were the one speaking. So what is the huge problem with that? So reporters have tested this, and they thought the perfect test subject to see, if it was really them or a computer would be to call their moms. And they thought, my mom would certainly know if it was me. Unfortunately, from all the cases that I've seen, the moms actually didn't recognize that they were speaking with a computer and not their child. And so this really is, questioning the very fundamentals of how we do international diplomacy, and if we can't trust who we're speaking with on the other end, right? These are sort of novel challenges. I don't think we've had these to the extent that we have them now, and deep staking people's faces and then, having them say things they never said. So, and then what we also are seeing in places like Myanmar is Facebook for a very long time was quite aware of sort of some of the impact it was having in exacerbating the ethnic conflict there. However, being a corporation, being this sort of new social media kind of platform organization, it did not really consider the consequences and the implications of some of this technology. And indeed, there is sort of a questioning of how we can hold these organizations accountable for that. How can we hold, Facebook accountable for the lack of action in the case of Myanmar? And Myanmar is just one example. There's places around the world where Facebook and other social media platforms have been used to exacerbate violence. Now, it's not all bad. A lot of these digital technologies allow civil society and international organizations to gain insight into places that would have not simply been, previously possible.
We could, I think, be doing a lot more to educate people, as has already been discussed at this conference, to the fact that war is illegal. And of course, it's illegal under the UN Charter with exceptions. If it's somebody claims it's defensive or it's authorized by the UN Security Council. And despite the fact that most of these wars, none of these recent wars, meet either of those loopholes, people imagine that maybe they do or probably they do. And so holding up the Kellogg-Briand Pact and saying, hey, there's also a law on the books that bans all war with no exceptions, and this nation and that nation and most big nations on earth are party to it, is something we could make use of. And we could do education around it. We could get non-party states to join the Kellogg-Briand Pact that never have, and ask the already existing members to start complying with it. We could draft model domestic legislation for penalties for individuals for violating it. We could democratize the International Court and the International Criminal Court and pursue prosecutions. We could democratize the UN and pursue various types of sanctions. We could treat the Hague Convention of 1907 as also being an existing law, and in combination with the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which requires nonviolent dispute resolution, require the specific nonviolent dispute resolution in the Hague Convention. Much as I would like to create another law that bans all war, it seems a little bit harder, and it seems to water down laws that we already have when we create new ones to do it again. We've had torture banned I don't know how many times in the United States with new exceptions each time, just as the United Nations re-banned war but with exceptions, meaning that it actually legalized war.
Share it. So our workshop generated the sketches that you see behind me. These are called business model canvases, and they're a way of mapping out the business structure for different industry sectors in what we call the business model of war. So we had an overflowing room, and we're able to kind of contain the conversation by constructing 6 or 7 of these maps or business models that represent how different industry sectors, or in this case, the one on the left, top left, is the media as an industry sector that supports, that has its own business model interconnected with the war industry. We have the weapons industry, extractive industries, mining and the colonization of mining, oil, finance.
So we had mostly people from Canada there and some people from other countries. And I was reminded of this morning, we heard we are living in exciting times where we can become global citizens or descend into chaos. And I've heard years ago that the way that we choose to organize as a society is reflected in our government. So especially we in the United States and Canada have an opportunity and maybe a responsibility to work for infrastructures for peace building in our government. A Department of Peace would lay groundwork for peace and create the environment for more peace building and a peaceful society.
Currently, tax resistance is not legal in Canada. It doesn't mean that it doesn't happen, but it's difficult for those who do it because they get legal action taken against them or so on. But actually, back in the 1850s, it was legal to conscientiously object against paying taxes for military spending in Canada. This is before Canada was a state. It was a colony of Britain. And it was for Quakers and Mennonites, and it was it drew a lot of immigrants from America because in the land of touted religious freedoms, these people could not legally not pay for things that were against their religion.
So then once you've gathered your information, you think there's a legal basis for your complaint, then say if you're going to be looking internationally, you can go to the International Criminal Court website or other international bodies' websites and find the criteria that they have in terms of what language it's submitted in, what specifics they require, any timelines that they have. So they said that information is pretty readily available. One thing that's interesting is that if you go the domestic route, then that's often a more expensive type of route because you need to hire lawyers and whatnot to help you with your case. But if you go internationally, an individual or an organization can submit a report or complaint internationally, and there's no cost for doing that. And in fact, if you do that, then they are required to respond to your complaint.
I work at World Service Authority, and if you spent the noon hour watching the film on Gary Davis that Arthur presented, that's the organization where I work. So I felt at the workshop that I should tell you more about Gary, about the work that we do on a day-to-day basis at World Service Authority to help stateless people, to help refugees, why these issues are so important. Plus, I kind of feel like that people don't completely get the idea of world citizenship enacted on a day-to-day basis. So to who are we? Of course, I would say we are all world citizens, human beings first and foremost. And to how do we ensure survival of humanity in the earth? We say, well, if we can see the world as one and start to create these structures of law at the global level that will help us to live together peacefully, that will ensure the survival of humanity and the earth.
Our workshop was called Organizing 101, Strategy, Intersectionality, and Millennials. We're just going to begin by giving a quick overview of what we covered during the workshop.
Is a very good PowerPoint of lots of going through the tactics and kind of the ramifications of using tactics in different ways.
How will the campaign concretely improve people's lives? How will the campaign provide people a sense of their power? How will the campaign alter the relations of power as well? So
people are divesting from fossil fuels, fossil fuel divestment, yes. Ban the bomb, divest, what was it? Don't bank on the bomb. And divestment from the war profiteers. So there's the BDS, yes, got BDSers here. There are things you can do wherever you are, and that's one of the wonderful things about this. As long as you're living in a town or city, you can talk to your city about divesting. If you go to church somewhere, you can look at where your church divests. If you're still working or if you're working, lots of places have retirement funds. You can ask where those retirement funds are invested.
She's talked about the history of the bases starting in 1785. We're talking U.S. And the foreign bases started with FDR's trade of 50 destroyers, World War I destroyers, for British access at their colonies. And so that was the beginning of our foreign bases. And but after World War II, we really moved in, particularly in the lands that we had lost. And so we now have lily pads. And that definition of that is when there are less than 200 soldiers there, I guess, military people. And lily pads are mostly for the drones. She showed presentations of different, a couple bases. Ramstein is the largest. It's an Air Force base, which has huge facilities for all the people there. And overall, there are over 200,000 Americans at foreign bases.
So for me, the high point of our gathering was sharing from each of the people as to what each of them are trying to do from where they are to create a culture of peace. And just some of the things mentioned. One was Jesse from Florida working on educating people regarding restorative justice and any other alternatives to violence that we can educate people toward. Several other people, including myself in Kitchener and Margaret in Peterborough, are working locally to coordinate the various peace activities that are happening in your own city. And in Kitchener W, we have a KW Peace Group that involves about 10 to 15 different groups coming together monthly to share what's happening and support each other.
So this particular session, I asked a lot of questions because I had never heard of the Permanent People's Tribunal. Tom Kearns presented it. He has a great PowerPoint presentation, which maybe he would offer to make available to the World Beyond War website, and people could take a look at it there. But it's basically a body of mostly judges that are international and independent from any sort of separate country. And there is a permanent people's tribunal that people can bring reports or cases or complaints regarding human rights. It's a human rights organization. It's descended from the Russell Sartre.
During the Bush era, when it was being considered to invade Iraq, he brought this up with his students and found that there was reluctance to talk about it, and he found that disconcerting. And this, I guess, I'm assuming, led to sort of efforts to be able to discuss issues like that are important to the children, to the country. And what he wanted to do, I guess, was to address that and to be able to talk about peace, I guess, in a few, to be said very quickly. So I guess what I found interesting about what he said is that he felt that education, peace education, should be considered for all subjects, not just as a subject in itself.
This session will examine how we can use our knowledge and skill sets to take action to enact change and build a war abolition movement worldwide that is diverse, inclusive, and widespread. How can we grow the grassroots power of the anti-war movement? By working in coalition with other groups, by making the interconnections between war and militarism and other issues facing our society and environment, from climate change to the refugee crisis to economic and racial inequality. What tactics can we use as a movement to be effective at enacting grassroots change? What are the stumbling blocks that our movement needs to address and focus on to become more effective?
Canadians have the highest, the most positive self-portrayal of their country's role in the world of any country. Over 9 in 10 people think Canada's a force for good in the world. The nationalist myth is incredibly strong, including far into the left and peace organizations, whatnot. So we have to break down some of that nationalism, and we have to start not presuming the best of our military, of our foreign policy leaders, but presuming the worst. Because the history suggests that Canada has, its foreign policy, its military policy has been about two things, primarily. Supporting empire, historically British, today American, advancing Canadian corporate interests abroad. That's overwhelmingly what drives Canadian foreign policy. And if we look at the history of Canadian militarism, what wars that Canada has participated in have been justified? When we sent 400 troops to help the British maintain control of Khartoum in 1884, 1885, was that morally justified? When we sent 7,000 troops to South Africa to help out Cecil Rhodes' mining interests and British imperial interests in South Africa, was that morally justified in the late 1800s? World War I, hundreds of thousands killed. What was that about? That was about advancing empire. The Korean War, what was that about? 27,000 Canadian troops, many naval vessels in a war that left millions of people dead. The first Iraq War, when we participated in that war, what was that about? That was about, you know, re-solidifying American dominance in the Middle East. The bombing of former Yugoslavia, late 1990s, the illegal bombing, was that justified? Afghanistan, more recently, 40,000 Canadian troops, or Libya, 2011. Look at the state of Libya, look at the state of Afghanistan today, right? We criticize our wars by saying we need our military to go elsewhere, to shift deployment. So this is Jack Layton in 2006, the former head of the New Democratic Party, saying, quote, "New Democrats have not written a blank check so that this government can drag Canada still farther into war, so that it can remove us farther from our role as international peacekeepers." So what's going on in Afghanistan is bad because we're not engaged in peacekeeping. So for instance, when Canadian peacekeepers helped in solidifying the coup against the elected government in Haiti in the mid-2000s, or take another case of Canadian, this peacekeeping that Jack Layton and Walter Dorn are proposing we engage in, the Congo in the early 1960s. Canadian peacekeepers were engaged, played an important role in the assassination of Patrice Lumumba.
And thank you to all of you for continuing to do the hard work of rendering visible and resisting the systems of death, devastation, and injury that the colonial, military, industrial, think tank, media, entertainment, national security complex would rather remain invisible and therefore irresistible. During the 19th and 20th centuries, as European states were developing the international laws of war that would apply to regulate and limit violence between themselves, they formulated these laws to deliberately exclude their colonies from many of the protections and restrictions they encoded. And so completely different sets of rules and logic were applied to war between civilized Europeans versus colonial relationships between those civilized Europeans and barbaric or savage non-Europeans. While the use of violence in return by the colonized was deemed inherently illegitimate and a justification for further infliction of colonial domination. The deep connections between the violence of settler colonialism against indigenous peoples and the violence of the war on terror against Muslims and others who are racialized or mistaken as Muslims are evident in the nomenclature employed by the American military, in the use of Geronimo as a code name for Osama bin Laden in the mission to assassinate him, in the use of the term Indian country to describe so-called enemy territory in Afghanistan and Iraq. As Cornell law professor Aziz Rana has observed, the legal logic of the war on terror resurrects the very same legal arguments that were used to rationalize what are commonly referred to as the American Indian Wars, but are more accurately described as European colonial genocide. And so, while the proponents of the war on terror argue that this is a completely new type of conflict, justified by what is claimed to be the unprecedented nature of the threat posed by global Islamist terrorism, when we look at history, we see that the specific forms of violence deployed in the war on terror, preemptive invasions, use of torture, extended occupations motivated by resource appropriation, we see that these forms of violence are actually very old, and that the abyssal logic of dehumanization underpinning all of them has been built into the very foundations of the modern international system. Many of the fundamental concepts in international law, war, human, rights, freedom, sovereignty, property, have been developed on Eurocentric colonial foundations and projected as universal through the epistemicide, the erasure of the worldviews of the colonized, of colonized people's understandings of what it means to be human, what it means to live in relationship with land and to each other, what it means to be just, what it means to be free. International law is a double-edged sword. It has functioned not only to protect people from certain forms of violence and abuse, but also to cloak colonial domination in a veil of legality, while displacing and destroying the traditions of knowledge of the colonized that are the grounds of truly critical anti-colonial resistance. And so let us all here work not only to dissent, but also to subvert the paradigms of violence, the structures of knowledge, law, language, and power that have made so much human and non-human suffering thinkable in the first place. We should remember that this land has been Turtle Island for far longer than it has been Canada. And from it, we may imagine and build a world that is truly beyond war and colonial violence for all who live in it. Assalamu alaikum.
We've had now nonviolent resistance movements in a modern sense going back more than 100 years, back to the Gandhi was the late 1890s. And over that time period, we've got a lot of lessons about what works and what doesn't. First off, it needs to be a mass movement. And what I mean by that is fringe movements don't win. Mass movements win. And so we want to develop a movement that pulls a lot of different groups to get groups of people together, different types of people together. In fact, another ingredient is diversity. Diversity is important because you want people with different backgrounds, experiences, understandings, because movements need to be creative. The third ingredient is we have to be working for something that there's a national consensus. We need a mobilized minority. The good news is the minority can be tiny, single digits. Research over the last 100 years shows that if you have a movement working for the national consensus, they have always won when as little as 3.5% of the people are mobilized. They win with less, but they've always won with 3.5%. Never lost. Dictatorship, democracy, mobilized people working for something we've developed national consensus have always won, and that's where we're going to be going in the next decade. We need to be resilient. Resilient because there are lots of challenges and movements. We often think that we're fighting and trying, and then small numbers of people show up at an event, and oh my gosh, we're losing. And it's easy to think you're losing. And that's why resilience is so important. We have to recognize that we are building a movement, and not every action has to be a big action. In fact, not every action is a resistance action. We need to actually cover multiple paths at once. We have to resist, and we have to build.
And you can feel how you will every time you see old glory unfurled, but these colors don't run. These colors don't run. These colors don't run the world.